They say weddings are supposed to be the happiest day of your life. For me, Walt Carver, it was the day champagne ran down my face while 200 guests looked on and the groom laughed. Mason Hawthorne, a young doctor with a talent for arrogance, called me a cheap maintenance man. He told me to leave, said this was a place for people of real class. I didn't answer. I just looked at him, at the expensive tuxedo, the polished shoes, the flawless smile, and thought about every check I had signed for him over the past 4 years. Every dollar came from the life insurance of my late wife, Evelyn. He didn't know that the man he was humiliating had paid for his medical degree, believing kindness could still shape a better man. Now he stood there, bathed in light and champagne, the symbol of everything hollow I had ever feared in the world. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. One call, that's all it would take for the glow around him to vanish like foam sliding off the rim of a glass. If this story sparks something in you, subscribe. Tell me where you're watching from, and trust me, you won't believe how this ends. Because when the curtain finally falls, you'll see who's been holding the real cards all along. That day, June in Wilmington, the sun was merciless. The white flags outside Christ Chapel glowed like they were on fire. I stood at the foot of the steps, listening to the string quartet echo through the open doors, the smell of lilies mixing with sweat and sunlight. My suit was 10 years old. The tie had been pressed that morning. I tugged at my cuff to hide a frayed seam, then walked inside. The hall was dazzling, too dazzling. Tables draped in satin centerpieces taller than a child, towers of Veuve Clicquot sparkling under chandeliers. The guests were surgeons, entrepreneurs, names I'd seen in business magazines. They talked about golf resorts, beach houses in Hilton Head, Tesla stocks. I nodded politely, then slipped to a quiet corner close enough to see the aisle, far enough not to be seen. Then Lydia appeared, my daughter. She stepped out in her white gown, clutching a bouquet of tulips. Beautiful. So beautiful, it hurt to look at her. She scanned the room, found me, smiled once, then turned back to her bridesmaids. Her face glowed with that fragile kind of joy people wear when they're afraid it might break. I knew that feeling. I had lived my life holding things together the same way, except no one ever looked at me with pride the way I looked at her just then. Mason stood by the window, tall, smooth, the kind of man who always believes the world owes him its reflection. When he shook hands, he smiled like he owned the air around him. I'd met him twice before, once at dinner, once at the engagement. Both times he'd been polite but cold, in that way people are when they've already decided you don't matter. The ceremony began. The minister spoke, the strings played. Lydia took Mason's hand under the soft glow of crystal light. I listened, steady, silent. When the applause came, I rose last. I moved toward her, ready to whisper something, a blessing maybe, but Mason turned away, first pulling her with him, smiling for the photographer. The reception was held at the Riverside Country Club a few blocks away. I parked my old Ford at the far end of the lot, among the rows of Mercedes and BMWs that shimmered in the sun like silver fish. In the rearview mirror, I saw my own reflection, gray hair, tired eyes, the faint lines of years spent fixing other people's broken things. I tightened my tie and stepped out. Inside, the ballroom blazed with light. Glass clinked. Laughter rolled like waves. The host announced the guests of honor, every title longer than the last. I sat at the far table, surrounded by Mason's distant relatives. They were polite in the way people are when they think they're being generous. One blonde woman turned and asked where I worked. When I said maintenance at St. Anne's Medical Center, she nodded, offered a clipped, "How nice," then turned away. I poured myself a glass of water and listened. Talk of Europe, new yachts, vacation homes in Florida. I didn't join in. I just let the noise fade until all I could hear was the slow rhythm of my own breath. When I finally stood to look for Lydia, a soft voice spoke behind me. I turned. A woman in her 60s stood there, graceful silver hair, cropped short, eyes sharp but kind. She wore a cream blouse and a simple pearl necklace. "You must be Mr. Carver," she said. "I'm Ruth Hawthorne Mason's mother." I nodded and rose, taking her hand. It was warm and steady. "I'm glad to finally meet you," I said. "I just hope Lydia's happy today." She smiled faintly, and in that smile there was something rare, something real. "You have the eyes of a man who's seen what truly matters," she said. "Not many in this room can say the same." For a moment I couldn't speak. The music in the distance shifted to Moon River, soft and fragile. In all the hollow toasts and laughter that day, hers was the only thing that felt honest. When she was called away, I sat again and watched the room. Mason raised a glass at the center table, his friends surrounding him like a constellation of mirrors. Lydia smiled beside him, but I noticed her hand tremble slightly on the stem of her glass. The golden light from the chandeliers washed over her dress, her face, her world. And in that glow, I understood something I never wanted to learn, that love alone doesn't always save people from their own pride. A waiter passed and asked if I wanted more champagne. I shook my head. Through the tall windows, I saw the sun sinking along the Cape Fear River, the reflections spilling like molten gold across the tables. And as I sat there, the laughter still echoing around me, I thought of Evelyn and wondered what she would have said if she had seen this. The sound of glasses clinking carried across the ballroom, sharp and steady, like metal striking crystal. Beneath it, a faint hum of jazz drifted from hidden speakers, warm but distant. I sat at a corner table watching golden light spill evenly across the ceiling, every shimmer reflecting off champagne glasses, as if even the air here was intoxicated by wealth. Lydia passed by with a small bouquet in hand. Her hair loosened from the ceremony, framing her face in soft curls. She smiled, a careful, practiced smile for the cameras circling her. When her eyes found mine, she gave a small nod, that kind of wordless reassurance only a daughter gives a father who doesn't belong in the room. I smiled back, raised my glass of water to say I was fine. But she kept glancing over as if she didn't quite believe it. At the front, Mason laughed. The light caught his face, all sharp lines and confidence, his new wedding band glinting as he lifted his glass. Every time he laughed, the room laughed with him. I watched, trying to see what it was that once made my daughter love him. Two men sitting behind me were talking too loudly, their voices carrying over the music. "Heard the bride's dad works maintenance at a hospital," one said. The other chuckled, just low enough to sound cruel. "St. Anne's right. Must be the guy mopping the hallways for us doctors." Their laughter fell perfectly between beats of the music, quick and cutting. Lydia was close enough to hear. Her smile froze for half a second before she jumped in with a story about the flowers. Her shoulders tightened. I saw it even from here. I looked down at my glass, turning it slowly in my hand. My reflection bent and warped in the water. For a moment I was back in those hospital nights, smelling disinfectant, hearing the hum of ventilators, the quiet sobbing that sometimes came from behind closed doors. In that place I never once felt small. But here, surrounded by polished shoes and champagne laughter, I felt like a man standing outside a window, watching a life that wasn't his. Mason broke from his circle of friends and walked toward me, glass in hand. His smile had that practiced smoothness that comes from being admired too early, too often. He leaned over the back of my chair, voice dripping with false warmth. "Need me to have the tailor fix that suit for the photos, Dad? Make it look a little sharper." I looked up at him and held his gaze until his smile started to waver. "Thanks," I said evenly. "But this is the suit I wore to my wife's funeral." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. The laughter nearby stopped the music suddenly too soft. Mason froze, then let out a short, uneasy laugh, trying to recover. Lydia had turned by then, her face flushed, her eyes darting down ashamed without knowing why. Mason nodded, forcing another smile. I just meant, it's for the photos, you know. They'll last a lifetime. I smiled back. A lifetime, Mason, can be shorter than you think. He blinked, unsure if he'd heard me right, then gave a stiff chuckle and patted my shoulder. You're a serious one, Dad. Just wanted you to be comfortable. I'm comfortable, I said. He walked away, still smiling, and I watched his back, the straight posture, the perfect fit of his jacket, the precision that left no room for humanity. Lydia's voice wove through the chatter behind him, brittle and too bright. Someone mentioned their honeymoon in the Bahamas. Mason laughed again, louder than before, as if to erase the moment entirely. I stood and stepped outside. The air beyond the ballroom was cooler, easier to breathe. From the terrace, I could see the Cape Fear River catching the light from the city, each ripple carrying a fragment of gold. Inside, the jazz and chatter blurred into a single hum. I leaned on the railing, staring at the dark water, and every image from the day replayed in my mind, like photographs exposed too long. The door opened softly behind me. Lydia stepped out, closing it with care. Dad. I'm sorry, she said. I turned, smiling. You've got nothing to be sorry for. Her eyes shimmered. Mason can be thoughtless. He didn't mean anything. I know, I said, resting a hand on her shoulder. When I was young, I thought words could fix anything, but some things don't need to be explained. She looked down, whispering, I just wanted today to be perfect. I nodded, eyes back on the river. Perfection doesn't mean without flaws, Lydia. Sometimes it's the crack that makes you remember it was real. The music shifted to something softer inside. Lydia hesitated. Dad. He's just nervous. He wants people to see he deserves to be here. I smiled faintly. Deserves what exactly? She didn't answer. She touched my hand gently, then turned back toward the doors. I stayed out there for a long time, listening to the water lap against the dock. Evelyn's face came to me then, her gentle smile from that old wedding photo, the one yellowed with time. I remembered her words once spoken half in jest, half in faith. Real kindness doesn't need to prove itself. It just shows up when it's needed most. And that night, for the first time, I wondered if my kindness had been given to the wrong person. Laughter rose again, from inside, loud and hollow. I walked back through the doors, slow and steady, the carpet soft beneath my shoes. Mason was posing for photos with Lydia arm tight around her waist. When he caught sight of me, he nodded, that flawless grin back in place. I nodded in return, calm as still water. My glass was where I'd left it, beads of condensation sliding down its surface. I took a sip, the coolness sharp in my throat. And as I looked across that glittering room, I realized something had cracked, small, invisible, but deep enough to change everything that would come after. I still remember the smell of antiseptic in the hallways of St. Anne's Hospital back in 2015. It clung to everything, the sleeves of my jacket, my hair, even the few hours of sleep I managed on the hard plastic chairs. Evelyn was in room 312, the window facing the parking lot, where the afternoon light always turned a pale, forgiving gold. I would sit by that window and watch her speak with a young resident nurse, her voice thin but calm, the same calm she had given to others for 30 years. She'd been head nurse in pediatrics, the one everyone went to when a patient was scared or when a doctor needed a steady hand. She had a way of speaking that made people believe pain was only temporary. But when she became the one lying in the bed, I learned what real courage looked like, knowing you were about to lose everything and smiling anyway. One evening after another scan, the doctor came in with the results. I sat there gripping my cap, afraid to ask what I already knew. Evelyn looked at me, voice barely above a whisper. "Walt, you know there are things we just can't fight." I bowed my head. She reached for my hand, her fingers cold, trembling. "Turn this pain into something good, Walt. If you can help someone later, help them." I didn't answer. I only nodded. 3 months later, she was gone quietly, the same way she had lived. The insurance check came soon after. $600,000. It looked like a fortune on paper, but when I folded the document, it felt no heavier than the silence that filled our house. Back home, the kitchen still smelled faintly of her morning coffee. I opened the drawer where she kept her work journals, pages of shift notes, advice for new nurses, lists of patient names. The handwriting was neat, careful. On the last page, ink had bled from a trembling hand. One small act of kindness can save a soul. A week later, I walked into City National Bank in downtown Wilmington to meet a financial advisor. He asked if I wanted to save or invest. I told him I wanted to build something with Evelyn's name on it. That's how the Evelyn Carver Medical Compassion Fund began, a scholarship, anonymous, designed for medical students who showed not only excellence but heart. I remember signing the papers. My hand shook, not from doubt, but from the weight of meaning. I thought if Evelyn were still alive, this is what she'd want to give those who heal others, the strength to keep doing it. The first month the fund opened, I received an application from the University of North Carolina School of Medicine, a young resident named Mason Hawthorne oncology track. His record stood out not just for grades, but for patient feedback. Attentive. Listens. Never judges. The letter of recommendation from his supervising physician said he had a natural compassion rare in medicine. I remember pausing at one line under clinical experience, participated in palliative care rotation at St. Anne's Medical Center, April-June 2015. I felt my chest tighten. That was Evelyn's final 3 months. I went through the old hospital records, checked the rotation log. There it was. Mason R. Hawthorne, Oncology Resident Room, 312. I remembered his face, young, sincere eyes, steady in a way that earned trust. He'd been there on the nights I couldn't stay. Sometimes I'd find him at Evelyn's bedside, explaining scans to her in a calm, honest voice, never hiding the truth, but never taking away hope. Evelyn had liked him. She once told me that boy has the heart of a real healer. I believed her. When I signed that first check transferring her insurance into his scholarship, I thought I was honoring her belief that compassion was the finest inheritance a person could leave behind. I stayed anonymous. Each quarter I received academic reports, grades, reviews, commendations. Every time I saw his name beside words like outstanding performance or empathy with patients, I felt a little lighter. 4 years passed that way. I never met him again, just his name in neat black print. I imagined Evelyn somewhere smiling, knowing her kindness had found a way to continue. But tonight, under the bright chandeliers and the clinking of crystal, the man who once bowed to patients, who once held my wife's trembling hand, now laughed at me with the arrogance of someone who believed kindness was weakness. He had forgotten those nights by her bed, forgotten the man who kept the ventilators running, who replaced the bulbs in the room where he learned what mercy looked like. I sat at the table, the light glinting through my glass of water. From across the room, I heard Mason's voice rise, confident, polished, as if the air itself belonged to him. Evelyn's voice echoed in my mind. turn this pain into something good, Walt. I had believed I was doing that. I had believed I was helping a good man. Until tonight. The music shifted into a slow jazz rhythm. Laughter swelled again. Somewhere near the stage, someone called for more champagne. I looked around the glittering room at the bright faces, the sparkling glasses, and realized the light reflected on them wasn't joy at all. It was pride so bright it blinded everyone in it. I walked slowly down the marble corridor of the Riverside Country Club, the sound of my shoes echoing softly, fading into the hum of distant music. In a tall mirror, I caught a glimpse of myself among the laughter and bright colors, a face so ordinary it could disappear into any crowd. A waiter passed with a silver tray, the reflection of chandeliers trembling across the polished metal, and I realized I was heading toward the Hawthorns' table. Ruth sat there, back straight, fingers resting on a glass of wine she hadn't touched. Her face carried the quiet fatigue of someone who had attended one too many evenings like this. Beside her was Richard Hawthorne Mason's father, tall, silver-haired, his gaze sharp and measuring. When he noticed me, he lowered his glass and smiled just enough to show civility. "Mr. Carver, isn't it?" "The bride's father," I nodded. "Yes, sir. A pleasure to meet you both." Richard extended his hand. His grip was firm and cold. His voice had the crisp precision of a man used to being listened to. "Mason tells me you work at St. Anne's Hospital. Maintenance, I believe?" "Yes," I said. "And it's a job I'm proud of." He smiled, though his eyes didn't. "Admirable. The world needs men like you, those who keep things running quietly, without needing recognition." His tone was smooth, polite but empty, like a compliment rehearsed for a company speech. I could feel the distance between us settle into every word. I smiled faintly and said nothing. Silence, I suppose, to a man like him, looked like weakness. He went on. "My wife mentioned you've been there for years now, retired 15 years, I said. "It's the kind of place that shows you who people really are." Ruth touched his wrist gently, a silent request to stop. But Richard only took another sip of wine and leaned closer. "Ever think of going private sector? You'd make more, and good tradesmen are in demand." "I made enough to live," I said slowly. "And more importantly, to live with myself." Richard chuckled softly, eyes narrowing with something like amusement. "The spirit of service. Quite noble. I'm sure your co-workers adored you." Then he turned away, conversation concluded, as if crossing my name off a list. Ruth stayed still for a moment, her gaze following her husband's back, her expression composed, but weary. When he drifted toward a group of investors near the bar, she looked back at me. "Don't take it to heart," she said, voice low but steady. "He doesn't know what real worth is." I shook my head. "I've spent my life in hospitals, Mrs. Hawthorne. I've seen people with degrees longer than their patients forget the simplest truth that work only matters if it's done with sincerity." Ruth regarded me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. She took a sip of wine, eyes thoughtful. "Good people don't need to prove they deserve to be here. They just keep doing what's right." The words dropped into me like a pebble into still water, small but heavy. She looked around the glittering room, her eyes distant. "You know," she said softly, "Mason's more like his father than I care to admit. Ambitious, brilliant, and sometimes too proud to remember why he began." Her voice dimmed. "I taught him that kindness was the root of all success. Somewhere along the way, he learned something else." I studied her face and saw a familiar loneliness, the same I'd once seen in Evelyn's eyes near the end. "Maybe it's not too late for him to remember," I said. Ruth smiled, a real smile this time, fragile and human. I hope you're right. A waiter refilled her glass. The light caught the surface of the wine, scattering reflections like tiny embers across the table. Across the room, Richard's laughter rose above the crowd as he shook hands with men in black tuxedos, his voice booming performative. Ruth glanced over, then back at me. "Do you know what tires me most, Mr. Carver?" she whispered. "Watching people measure worth by what's in a wallet instead of what's in their eyes." "Maybe they forget," I said quietly, "that the shine of gold is only reflection, not light." Her eyes met mine deeper now, and for a moment I think she understood everything I meant. There was a strange stillness between us, two strangers, bound by the same exhaustion. One who had lost faith in dignity and one who had given up comfort to keep it. The music shifted to an old swing tune. The younger guests flooded the dance floor, laughing, spinning under the flash of cameras. Mason pulled Lydia into the center, twirling her under the spotlight. Her smile was bright but fragile. His was the kind that owned the room. Ruth watched them, pride and worry braided into one look. She set her glass down gently. "Mr. Carver," she said, "I believe you taught your daughter the most important thing, not how to live richly, but how to live honestly." "I just hope she's happy," I said. "Wherever she is, whoever she's with, I only hope she's treated with respect." Ruth pressed her lips together, gaze turning from the dance floor. "If the day ever comes when you need someone to bear witness to the truth," she said softly, "oh, me." The words struck like a bell, quiet but resonant. I was still searching for a reply when Richard returned. Grin-wide glass lifted. Ruth's face softened instantly, her public smile snapping back into place. Richard leaned down slightly. "Mr. Carver, I trust you're enjoying the evening." I met his eyes, my own smile polite, steady. "Very much, Mr. Hawthorne. I've learned a few things worth remembering." He didn't catch the weight of it, only nodded and walked away. Ruth touched my shoulder lightly, before following him, a gesture that felt halfway between gratitude and apology. I sat there for a while longer, the light from the chandeliers glinting off my glass of water. Ruth's words echoed in my mind. Good people don't need to prove they belong. The phrase lingered, merging with the laughter, the music, and the soft hiss of champagne being poured nearby. Across the room, Mason stood surrounded by friends, his eyes bright, his hand on Lydia's back in a gesture that looked more like possession than affection. And in that shimmering light, I saw it clearly, the difference between what glitters and what is true. One was the reflection of glass, the other the quiet light that never fades. The host stepped onto the stage, the microphone crackling softly before settling into silence. "Ladies and gentlemen, please raise your glasses for the bride and groom, and let's hear a few words from those closest to them." The lights dimmed. A soft glow settled on the main table where Mason and Lydia sat. I was 3 tables away, close enough to see the shine in his smile, far enough to study the faces around him. A young man stood up, confidence radiating from his posture. His voice carried the easy cadence of someone used to being heard. "I'm Paul Bennett, Mason's friend from Harvard," he said, lifting his glass with a grin. "We spent those unforgettable years together, and I can say without a doubt one embodies the Hawthorne legacy of excellence better than Mason. From Harvard to Johns Hopkins, he has always led with brilliance, discipline, and natural talent." Applause swelled. I took a sip of water. Paul continued, his tone bright and admiring. "Of course, Mason's drive runs in the family. The son of the esteemed surgeon, Dr. Richard Hawthorne, the 3rd generation of a family devoted to medicine. A true heir to dedication and achievement." More applause. Glasses clinked. Smiles flashed. And still not one word about scholarships or about the Evelyn Carver Fund. that had quietly carried him this far. I felt a cold draft slide through me, as if someone had opened a window in the middle of that golden room. Mason smiled for the crowd, his hand resting on Lydia's shoulder, a perfect picture of composure. A few minutes later, Lydia slipped away from the main table and walked toward me. Her face was calm, but her eyes betrayed the tension she tried to hide. "Dad," she said quietly, "I know he's a little showy, but please don't make this a big deal." I looked at her, the reflection of the chandeliers flickering in her eyes, making them look as if they might break. "What do you think I'm going to do?" She bit her lip. "I just don't want you to be upset. This is supposed to be a happy day." I touched her hand lightly. "I didn't come here to start anything, Lydia. I'm just listening." She nodded, forcing a smile, then turned back toward the stage, just as the host called Mason up to speak. The music faded. Mason stepped forward, microphone in hand, smiling as though this were a press conference rather than a wedding. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he began. "I'm grateful to everyone who's shared this special day with us." He paused, scanning the room. I felt his eyes linger on me just long enough to make sure I noticed. Life has given me more than I ever dreamed of: a wonderful family, a father who's been a guiding example, and now a wife I'm proud to call my own. Applause erupted again. Lydia clasped his hand, her smile wavering. Mason lifted his glass of Dom Perignon, his voice lowering into something smoother, slower. "Not everyone gets to stand in a place like this, surrounded by people who truly understand what success means." He stopped for a breath, eyes locking on me across the tables. "Not everyone belongs here." The words slid through the air like a blade. Soft laughter broke from one of the nearby tables, short, awkward, the kind that hides discomfort behind politeness. A few guests glanced my way, then quickly looked elsewhere. Lydia froze behind Mason, her lips pressed tight. I sat still, my hand resting on the table, feeling the chill from my glass spread through my fingers. Mason lowered his drink, continued speaking, but his words blurred into the background. All I could hear was the hum of the room, the shuffle of silverware, the slow pour of champagne into waiting glasses. The faces around me warped in the light, smiles melting into something uncertain, distorted by reflection. A man at the next table leaned toward me, voice soft. "Don't mind him, Mr. Carver. Just a joke." I nodded slightly, eyes still fixed ahead. "Some jokes reveal more than they hide," I said. Lydia came back, placing a hand on my shoulder. "Dad, please," she whispered. "Don't be angry. He's had a few drinks, that's all." I covered her hand with mine, my voice calm. "It's all right, sweetheart. I'm used to being misunderstood." Her eyes brimmed. "Don't say that." I smiled faintly, though it felt heavy. Across the room, Mason basked in another wave of applause. "And to everyone who's believed in me," he said proudly, "especially my family, for shaping the man I am today." A bitter smile crossed my face before I could stop it. None of them knew the man they were celebrating once knelt beside my dying wife's bed, promising he'd never forget what compassion looked like. And yet here he was, the same lips that once spoke gratitude now curled into pride. He ended his speech with one final toast, the golden bubbles of champagne catching the light, as if mocking the room's admiration. I stared at the glass he raised, the reflection cold and hollow. Nothing like the quiet, genuine light that used to live in his eyes. Applause again. Loud. Rhythmic. Empty. Lydia smiled for the crowd, her hand trembling. I sat still, scanning the room. Ruth stood in the corner, her gaze meeting mine, sad understanding. She shook her head slightly, a silent plea for restraint, then turned away. The music started again, bright, and cheerful, but no one really listened. I took the last sip of my water and set the glass down. I could feel it now, the faint tremor beneath the surface, the tiny fractures spreading through the polished veneer of this perfect evening. I lifted my head. The chandelier light hit my eyes sharp and blinding, and beneath the laughter and music I heard it, the thin, inevitable sound of something about to break. The echo of clinking glasses still hung in the air when Mason stepped into the center of the ballroom. His face was flushed eyes gleaming with that drunk, dangerous kind of confidence. In his hand, a glass of Dom Perignon 2014 foam spilling down the neck of the bottle. People around him laughed, thinking he was about to say something funny. I stayed still, not yet knowing what was coming, but already feeling the room tighten as if something was about to crack. Mason raised his glass, his voice booming across the hall. Before this night ends, I'd like to thank someone very special, someone to whom we all perhaps unknowingly owe a debt of gratitude. He paused, turned toward me, his smile crooked. My father-in-law, Mr. Walt Carver. A few polite claps, uncertain and scattered. Some guests looked around, waiting for the punchline. Mason lifted his glass higher, his tone brightening. This man dedicated his life to keeping the floors of St. Anne's Hospital spotless. No one, and I mean no one, has kept our doctor's shoes cleaner than he has. Laughter broke out, short, awkward bursts. Someone tried to stifle a chuckle but failed. Mason soaked it in the way a performer enjoys the sound of his own applause. Lydia stood a few feet away, her face drained of color. Ruth pressed a trembling hand to her chest, eyes wide. And so Mason went on as a token of my gratitude. I'd like to make a toast to him. To the unsung hero of every hospital hallway, the man who scrubbed away the blood so we could save lives. He laughed. Then before anyone could react, he tilted the glass and poured it over my head. The champagne hit cold, seeping down my collar, soaking my shirt. The scent of yeast and grapes mixed with the warmth of the room. Someone gasped. Then nothing, no music, no whispers, no breath. Only the slow drip of liquid onto the wooden floor. Mason leaned in, his voice sharp and slurred. You don't belong here. Get out. The words sliced through the silence. A few people gave nervous laughs. Others lowered their glasses, avoiding eye contact. I didn't move. The chill from the champagne was spreading down my back, but my heartbeat was steady, almost unnaturally slow. 2 security guards started forward. One reached for Mason's arm, the other looked at me for permission. I lifted a hand. It's fine, I said evenly. Don't touch him. The stillness that followed felt endless. Lydia broke it first, sobbing. She rushed toward Mason, clutching his arm. What are you doing? She cried. Mason laughed, shaking her off. Relax, it's a joke. Everyone's laughing. But no one was. Ruth stayed seated, her eyes fixed on her son, her face crumpled in disbelief, as if something inside her had just broken for good. Richard stood behind her silent, his expression caught somewhere between shame and paralysis. I reached into my pocket and took out a handkerchief, wiping my face. Drops of champagne slid from my hair to the floor, each one landing with the same sound as the applause that had filled this room not long ago. I looked up at Mason. He was only a few steps away, close enough for me to see the sweat mixed with wine on his forehead. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. My silence pressed harder than any words. His breathing quickened, eyes flicking around, as if he'd just realized the performance was over. Someone set a glass down too hard. The sharp clink echoed across the room. I reached into my jacket again slowly and pulled out my phone. Wiped the screen clean. A small motion, but the air shifted. The crowd held its breath. Ruth's head turned sharply. She seemed to understand before anyone else. Mason froze, his grin dissolving. I didn't press anything. I just held the phone looking at him. That was enough. The hum of the air conditioner filled the silence. Lydia stood by the table, trembling fingers gripping the edge of the linen cloth. Nothing moved. The only sound left was the faint dripping of champagne from my hair onto the floor, forming a thin, glistening line that caught the light. The scent was thick, sweet, metallic, unbearable. Mason took a step back, stammering. "Come on, old man. I was just kidding. Don't look so serious." I didn't answer. My eyes stayed on him steady, unblinking. Whatever anger I'd had was gone. What remained was truth bare, unspoken, and impossible to hide from. A man at the next table whispered, "Christ, he's lost it." Another murmured, "Poor guy." "This is unreal." The words rippled through the room, then faded. I turned toward Lydia. Her face was wet, her eyes wide and broken. I gave a small nod, not forgiveness, not comfort, just a quiet assurance that I was still here. Then I looked back at Mason. "You should take a break," I said softly. My voice wasn't raised, but it carried. The whole room heard it. Mason opened his mouth, but Ruth was already on her feet. "That's enough, Mason," she said. Her voice trembled, but carried the kind of authority that silences a room. "Enough." He stopped. His color drained. His eyes darted, searching for somewhere to land, but there was nowhere left to hide. Around us, guests looked away. Some checked their phones. Others just stared into their glasses. The air was heavy, so thick it felt like it could choke you. I dropped the handkerchief onto the table, took a step back. The lights above were still blinding. The music had long since died. I lifted my phone slightly. Its screen cast a pale reflection on Mason's face. I didn't speak. I didn't have to. The silence spoke louder than any accusation could. And in that silence, I knew everything had shifted. Not because of the champagne, but because of the single fatal mistake he'd just made, believing he could humiliate someone without ever having to pay the price. I walked slowly through the ballroom, the polished oak floor reflecting the light like a still lake. My footsteps fell in steady rhythm, measured cold, pulling the air taut as hundreds of people held their breath. Every laugh, every clink of glass, every note of music had died. Only the sound of my shoes remained echoing closer toward the center of the room, where Mason stood, frozen, the empty glass trembling in his hand, his eyes unfocused under the glare. I stopped a few steps from him. The air between us was tight enough to hum. I looked straight into his eyes, my voice low, even each word landing like a verdict. "You should know something, Mason. That scholarship you received, it didn't come from any prestigious family." He blinked, lips parting, but no sound came out. I lifted my phone. The screen's blue glow lit his face, and the words were there for everyone to see. Evelyn Carver, Medical Compassion Fund. A ripple of whispers swept across the hall. Faces that had glowed with admiration moments ago turned rigid. Guests leaned toward one another, murmuring. At the next table, Ruth gripped her wine glass so tightly it spilled down her wrist. She stepped forward, her voice trembling. "Evelyn. Carver." I nodded. "My wife's name. The woman you cared for in her final days at St. Anne's Medical Center." No one moved. I set my leather briefcase on the table, unlatched it. Inside, the files were stacked, neatly edges, yellowed seals, still embossed. I pulled one folder free, opened it to the first page. Scholarship certificate. Bank verification. A signature at the bottom, clean and unmistakable, Mason R. Hawthorne. I held it up, my voice cutting through the silence. The very first recipient. $600,000. Every cent from my late wife's life insurance. I built that fund to help young doctors who showed compassion, who understood what it meant to care for human beings. I thought I was planting trust. I paused. Seems I sowed it in the wrong soil. A collective intake of breath. Someone covered their mouth. A man at the back gave a small nod as if a puzzle had just fallen into place. Mason's face had drained of color. His hands trembled, the glass tipping foam spilling down his shirt. He stammered, his voice cracking. "You're lying. I never knew. I didn't take any money from you." I let the silence stretch before setting the document down on the table between us. "Your signature's right here," I said. "Every term you signed the acceptance. You even wrote a letter, said you'd never forget the lesson in compassion from room 312. Do you remember Mason, room 312? The woman with silver hair who greeted you every morning. The one you called the kindest patient I've ever met." His face locked in place. I saw the moment recognition struck, the flicker of memory, then the horror that followed. Ruth brought a hand to her mouth, whispering, "Evelyn Carver." My God. I remember. 2015. I visited Mason during his residency. He told me about a patient named Evelyn, said she gave him a small Bible before she passed. I nodded slowly. That Bible was hers. She handed it to you 2 days before she died. And she was the reason I believed kindness could still save people. But tonight, I drew a breath. Tonight I learned there are souls even compassion can't reach. The air in the room collapsed. Somewhere behind me, a glass shattered against the floor, but no one turned. Richard stood rigid, hands clasped before him, his face twisted like something inside was breaking. Mason shook his head, words tumbling out. "You don't understand. I didn't know where the money came from. I worked hard. I earned, you didn't have to know," I said softly. My tone was quiet, but the weight of it carried. Kindness doesn't ask to be known. But what you did tonight, that was my answer. And it's one I'll never forget. He started to move toward me, but Ruth reached him first. She placed a hand on his arm and shook her head once small, final. Her eyes were hollow, stripped of anger, filled only with the kind of grief that words can't touch. I looked at her, then at her son. There was nothing left to say. I gathered the papers, slid them back into the case, and closed it. No one moved. The air conditioner hummed above us, the only sound left in the world. I straightened my collar, glanced once around the room. The proud faces from earlier now lowered, silent, ashamed. I spoke quietly, my voice even almost gentle. Sometimes justice doesn't need to raise its voice. Then I turned and walked away through the maze of tables, the wet fabric of my jacket catching the light. My footsteps landed like soft hammer strikes against glass. When my hand touched the door, the silence broke, Lydia's sobs, the scrape of a chair, Ruth's trembling sigh. And I knew from that moment on, no one in that room would ever look at Mason the same way again. Outside, the Wilmington night met me with a rush of damp river air. The scent of champagne lingered on my clothes, faint and sour. I looked toward the Cape Fear, the streetlights shimmering on the water. Some stains, I thought, can only be washed away by silence. 3 days later, Wilmington no longer felt like the quiet town it used to be. Every cafe along Front Street buzzed with the same story. On phone screens everywhere, a 90-second clip looped endlessly. Dr. Mason Hawthorne, the young physician from St. Anne's, pouring champagne over his father-in-law's head at his own wedding. And the moment after, the older man drenched and silent, raising his phone. The room freezing. The truth landing without a single shout. The video's title on YouTube read, "Doctor Humiliates Father-in-Law, Then Learns He Paid His Tuition." Over 2 million views in less than 3 days. On Twitter, Reddit, and every North Carolina forum, people called it instant karma, the quietest act of justice, the slap that never needed a hand. I sat in my small house by the river, the ping of messages coming one after another. Strangers wrote to thank me, to tell their own stories of humiliation, of dignity, of how that clip made them believe again in quiet strength. I answered no one. I just read, then deleted. I didn't feel triumphant, only hollow, the kind of emptiness that seeps into the stillness of morning. On the kitchen table lay an open copy of the Wilmington Tribune. The front page carried a column by Elliot Crane, the city's social affairs writer. A man of quiet dignity teaches Wilmington a lesson in respect. He wrote, the man in that video never shouted, never demanded his honor back. He silenced an entire room with the truth, and perhaps that's how justice should sound. I closed the paper. I never wanted fame. I only wanted peace, the kind that existed before my daughter married the wrong man. But once a story leaves your hands, it no longer belongs to you. It becomes what others choose to tell. And people, they prefer their tragedies with neat endings, not the tangled truths of the human heart. That afternoon, I drove past the old hospital. On the sign outside St. Anne's, a new notice had been posted. Dr. Mason Hawthorne, indefinite suspension, pending ethics review. I parked across the street and looked at it for a long time. A nurse passing by recognized me, nodded respectfully. I nodded back, saying nothing. The news had spread faster than I ever expected. The ethics board had launched a formal inquiry. Local stations spoke of a medical ethics scandal and a blow to the hospital's public image. Mason disappeared from the hospital. Lydia turned off her phone, shut down her social media. Word was she was staying with a friend in Raleigh, not speaking to anyone, not even me. I understood. Some collapses must hit bottom before the person inside can look up. On the third night, rain came hard. I sat on the porch listening to it strike the tin roof. The streetlight shimmered in the puddle by the gate. Then headlights cut through the downpour. A silver sedan pulled in. Ruth Hawthorne. She stepped out without an umbrella, her beige coat already soaked, clutching a white envelope. She walked slowly, as if trying to bear the cold for someone else. I opened the door and let her in. The house was warm, the air still carrying yesterday's coffee. She sat in the wooden chair by the table, placed the envelope down, but said nothing at first. The lamplight caught every line of exhaustion on her face. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled. I came to say what my son should have said. I'm sorry for what Mason did. He forgot his oath as a doctor, and worse, he forgot that every life he touched once taught him to bow before compassion. I didn't answer. The rain filled the silence for us. Ruth opened the envelope, pulled out a folded sheet of paper. The handwriting tilted, unsteady but strong. She laid it in front of me. This letter isn't for forgiveness, she said quietly. It's to say I understand what my son must face now, and that you are not alone in your pain. I read slowly. The ink had bled in places, but the meaning was clear. I'm sorry, my son forgot the lesson your late wife once taught him. Evelyn Carver. That name reminds me of the grace I saw when she smiled from her hospital bed. Wilmington may not deserve the pain both of you endured, but it needed the lesson. I set the letter down, my fingertips damp. Outside, the rain had eased. Streetlights stretched long reflections across the road. Maybe Evelyn knew all along, I said softly. That kindness doesn't need to be seen. and that the truest act of kindness is knowing when to stay silent. Ruth looked up, eyes red but steady. She exhaled slowly. I don't know if my son will recover from this. Some people, I said, have to lose everything before they can see what they had. She nodded, shoulders trembling, then rose to leave. At the door, she paused without turning back. If Evelyn were still alive, she said, I think she'd be proud of you. I smiled faintly. Evelyn never cared about pride, I replied. She only cared about what was right. When the door closed, only the sound of wind and the Cape Fear remained. I sat there a long time watching the letter beside the cold cup of coffee. The words blurred, but their truth had never been clearer. Some storms come only once, tearing away everything false. And when they pass, what's left isn't ruin, but truth bare and bright enough to hurt. The story didn't fade the way I thought it would. After that night, Wilmington caught a fever. From the small cafes by the river to the evening news on WECT, everyone was talking about the same thing: the young doctor who humiliated his father-in-law, then got exposed at his own wedding. The clip was barely 2 minutes long, but it was everywhere. Some called me the calmest father in America. Others called Mason the man who broke the Hippocratic oath with a glass of champagne. I never watched it, but I couldn't escape it. At the convenience store, the screen above the counter replayed the scene: laughter, gasps, the silence that followed. In the hospital parking lot, 2 security guards talked near the gate. You see that clip. One sentence and he froze an entire room. At the barbershop, people speculated whether I'd sue the Hawthorns. People love to talk about justice, but few understand how rare it truly is. A local paper ran it on the front page: Doctor humiliates father-in-law, discovers he paid his tuition. Below it, a photo from the wedding, the light catching the shoulder of my dark suit, my face slightly turned down. They picked the perfect frame to make me look like the symbol of restraint. By Monday morning, Elliot Crane's article in the Wilmington Tribune had gone statewide. A man of quiet dignity teaches Wilmington a lesson in respect. He wrote, "This man had no power, no status, yet silenced an entire city with one act by speaking the truth when he was humiliated." I read it in a small cafe by the fogged window. My coffee went cold before I finished. I felt no pride, no vindication. I didn't want to teach Wilmington a lesson. I only wanted peace for myself and for my wife. But the tide didn't calm. A feature from the Atlantic South went viral titled, "Respect is not a title, it's a behavior." It described me, a man named Walt Carver, as a portrait of the working-class American father, the forgotten figure of quiet integrity in an age obsessed with image. That line stopped me cold. Maybe they were right. Maybe all my life I'd walked the same hospital corridors, patching leaks, fixing what others broke, scrubbing what others left behind, but somehow I'd kept my hands clean. I kept working as always. 6 a.m. drive the old pickup to St. Anne's Clock and check the ventilation systems. Some people stared longer now. Some smiled. One morning, a young logistics worker stopped me in the hallway, reached out his hand. "You make us proud, sir." I shook his hand and smiled. Compliments, however kind, never reach the place where a wound truly lives. My workshop sat down in the basement concrete walls, the hum of compressors steady and low. I liked it there. Down here, no one mentioned the Hawthorns, just the quiet rhythm of machines breathing. One afternoon, the head nurse came in holding a sealed envelope stamped with the logo of the North Carolina Medical Ethics Board. She placed it on my desk. "This came for you." I wiped my hands and opened it. Ivory paper, crisp type. After reviewing the public incident that affected the integrity of the medical profession, the board hereby suspends Dr. Mason R. Hawthorne for a period of 1 year, citing violation of professional ethics and misconduct in a public setting. I read it once, folded it, and said nothing. The nurse hesitated. "You knew him," I nodded. "I thought I did." That evening I stood outside the hospital courtyard watching a group of interns cross the lawn. One of them said to another, "I saw the video. Makes you think we should talk to patients with more kindness." The other nodded. "Yeah. Respect's not in the syllabus, but it should be in your heart." I heard every word, and for the first time in months, something heavy inside me lifted, like setting down a stone I'd carried too far. That night back home, the radio played a segment quoting the same article, "Respect is not inherited. It is earned. It is built in silence, tested in humiliation, and proven through restraint." I turned the radio off and listened to the wind moving along the Cape Fear River. The air smelled of rain salt and the old pine of my porch. On the table, the letter from the ethics board lay beside Evelyn's photo. The lamplight caught the glass, and for a moment, it looked as though she were watching me, calm, wordless, forgiving. I leaned back and whispered, "Evelyn, maybe this is how justice works. Slow, quiet, but steady enough to remind us that every action comes with a cost." Outside, Wilmington sank into darkness. But inside, something flickered to life, not pride, not relief, just the quiet sense that at last everything had settled into its rightful place. A week later, Wilmington was still murmuring, still restless, but Mason Hawthorne's name had begun to vanish from the news cycle. The headlines that once screamed his story now hunted fresher prey. Silence always follows a storm, this way, sudden, unspectacular, leaving only debris and the echo of what's been broken. Word reached me that St. Anne's had formally terminated Mason's contract. The scholarship fund revoked. His medical license suspended. The $300,000 once paid by the Evelyn Carver Fund now reclassified as personal debt, his burden to carry. That same afternoon, a letter arrived in my mailbox. No name on the envelope, just a handwriting I recognized, tilted, fragile, trying hard to stay steady. Inside were 3 pages written in blue ink. The strokes trembled, but the words did not. "I don't expect forgiveness. Some wounds aren't meant to heal, only to be acknowledged. I can't undo what I've done, but I'm trying to become the man Mrs. Evelyn once believed I could be. I forgot what she told me that day in her hospital room, that compassion isn't instinct, it's a choice. And I chose wrong. Now I'm learning to begin again from the ground where I belong." Mason R. Hawthorne. I folded the pages and set them on the table, staring at them the way one looks at an old scar, closed, but never quite gone. That evening, Lydia came home. She stepped through the door carrying a small suitcase, her hair pulled back, her face thinner, but her eyes calm. She looked around the house, then at me, and gave a quiet smile. "I'll stay here for a while, Dad." I nodded. No questions. She needed a place to breathe away from the cameras, the whispers, the noise. Later that night, as I washed the dishes, she walked in holding Mason's letter. She read it slowly, folded it neatly, neither crying nor tearing it. "I don't hate him," she said, "but I see him now." I turned. In her eyes was something I hadn't seen before. Not sorrow, not rage, but the clarity that comes when love finally looks itself in the mirror and recognizes pride for what it is. We ate in silence. The sound of forks meeting porcelain filled the small kitchen. Outside, the streetlights shimmered across the river. I remembered when she was a child, how Evelyn would bake cookies on stormy nights to drown out the thunder, and Lydia would sit beside her, their hands intertwined. Now there were only 2 of us left, yet the quiet no longer felt heavy. After a while, Lydia asked, "Are you angry, Dad?" "Anger?" I said, "belongs to those who still hope others can change." "I'm not angry. Just sorry. She looked down, said nothing. Justice, I added, doesn't need to be seized. You just give it time. Time's the only judge that never takes sides. She smiled faintly. You always believe in time. Because I said it never lies. Days passed. Lydia began rebuilding her life from the ground up. She shut off her phone, deleted her social accounts, requested leave from her marketing job in Charlotte. By day, she helped me repaint the fence, clear out the old shed. By night, we drank tea without talking much. The silences were long, but they no longer hurt. One afternoon, she placed her wedding photo on the table. The frame, once glossy, now cracked at the corner. She stared at it for a long while. I don't know if I was wrong to marry him, she said. But if I hadn't, I might never have learned what respect really means. Sometimes I told her we have to lose what we believed was right to understand what truly matters. Before bed, she stopped by my door. Did you read his letter again? Not yet, I said, but I'll keep it. Every apology has value, even the late ones. That night, I lay awake listening to the river, the steady pulse of water against the banks. I thought of Mason, not with anger anymore, but with the weary compassion one feels for someone who's traded his soul for the easier road. I didn't want him to repay me. It was never about money. What I wanted was for him to learn the lesson Evelyn once lived by, the same lesson I'd spent half a lifetime trying to grasp, that kindness isn't a weapon, it's a mirror. It reflects who truly deserves to stand before it. Morning came soft and pale. Lydia brewed coffee and the aroma spread through the house like warmth, finding its way back into old wood. She sat at the table typing on her laptop. When I asked what she was writing, she said she was applying for a position at the Wilmington Public Library. I don't want to leave this place, she said quietly. Not yet. I smiled. That's a good choice. Around here, people still greet each other with their eyes. Later, through the window, I watched her kneel in the garden, trimming the lavender Evelyn once planted. Sunlight fell across her hair, turning it to gold. And in that moment, I understood every wound given time finds its way back to skin. No matter what we'd lost, I still had what mattered most, a daughter who could bow to truth but never to pride. That morning, Wilmington carried a strange kind of light, the kind that only comes after a storm has passed clean, but melancholy, as if the sky itself was exhaling. I was sitting on the porch, a cup of coffee warming my hands, when I heard a car pull up by the gate. When I looked up, I saw Ruth stepping out. She looked tired. Her coat pulled tight against the wind, but her eyes, calm, steady, were still the same. She held a worn envelope tucked carefully inside a file folder. I invited her in, but she stopped at the doorway, her voice soft. They've been reorganizing the hospital records this week. In one of the oncology cabinets, they found a letter. No recipient listed, but the moment I saw the handwriting, I knew who it was meant for. She placed the envelope in my hand, nodded once, and said nothing more. I sat at the table and opened it. My pulse slowed. The scent of old paper rose up, faint lavender mixed with dust, the same scent that used to linger in Evelyn's office. The page was folded in half, thin, and yellowed at the edges, the handwriting round and neat, though the ink trembled toward the end of each line. I began to read. If one day you're reading this, it probably means I'm gone. Don't be angry at anyone for what I've had to endure. Life isn't fair, but kindness should always keep its shape. If kindness is a weakness, let it be the weakness that wakes others up. Never let anyone convince you that compassion is a mistake. Because when someone chooses to do what's right, no matter how cold the world becomes, another small light appears. I stopped. My hands shook. My eyes burned. I could almost hear her voice, soft and sure, echoing through the old corridors of St. Anne's, blending with the antiseptic air and the beeping of heart monitors. Ruth finally stepped inside, sitting across from me. Her voice was quiet. She wrote that 3 days before she passed. Left it in her file, said the person who needed it would find it when the time came. I nodded, unable to speak. Ruth reached across the table, her hand resting lightly on mine. I've watched my son collapse under the weight of his own pride, she said, her eyes full of something like grief. Now I understand what Evelyn was trying to teach us. Then she stood and left me alone with the letter. Later that morning, I took it to Riverwalk Park. The air was bright, the river glassy, the sunlight scattering across the Cape Fear like 1,000 broken mirrors. I sat on the same wooden bench where Evelyn and I used to sit in our early years, when the world still felt like it could be rebuilt with 2 hands and enough love. As I read the letter again, each line felt like a thread pulling the torn pieces of my heart back together. I whispered, "You were right, Evelyn. Some wounds don't need revenge. They just need remembering." I stayed there until the light turned amber. A young girl passed by, dropped a single flower into the water. It spun slowly before disappearing into the current. I watched it drift away, thinking of Evelyn, of Mason, of all the things time had taken and somehow returned in different forms. When I got home, I went straight to the living room and took the old photo album down from the shelf. The leather cover was cracked, but still carried the faint scent of pine, Evelyn's favorite. I turned to the middle page, her in her white coat, smiling softly, though her eyes looked tired. I slipped the letter behind that photo and closed the album gently, my hand resting on the cover. The late afternoon sun streamed through the blinds, casting golden bars across the room. Dust floated in the light like tiny galaxies, each speck a memory shimmering for a moment, before fading back into air. And I realized then some things never truly disappear. They only change form into breath, into light, into the quiet persistence of kindness that Evelyn left behind. Outside, Lydia was trimming the lavender bushes. The sun fell across her hair, setting it aglow like a small candle in the yard. I watched her for a long moment, then looked down at the album in my hands and smiled. "Evelyn, you did it. Your light still burns not in the hospital, but in the hearts you once touched, and in this house where kindness still has enough strength to brighten the last evening of autumn." 1 year later, autumn returned to Wilmington. The maples along the entrance to St. Anne's were gold again, the air full of pine and coffee drifting from the small cafe across the street. I stood in the lobby looking up at a new banner strung above the doors, Community Service Recognition Ceremony. Someone had written in chalk beneath it, celebrating quiet heroes. I never thought of myself as one of them, but people insisted on calling me that. The ceremony was held in the main hall. Light fell softly across the stage. Every seat was filled. I spotted Ruth and Lydia sitting in the front row. Ruth wore an olive coat, her expression calm, settled, the kind of peace that comes only after years of storms. Lydia turned, caught my eye, and smiled. That one small gesture was enough to warm the entire room. Near the stage stood Elliot Crane, the reporter who had written the article a year ago. He gave me a brief wave, his camera slung at his side, waiting. When the host called my name, Mr. Walt Carver, maintenance technician, and founder of the Evelyn Carver Compassion Fund, the room grew quiet. I stepped up to the stage. My footsteps echoed on the wooden floor. The lights were bright enough to blur the faces in the audience into a soft sea of color. I took the microphone, breathed once, and spoke. I was once told I didn't belong anywhere, that I was just the man in the corner, the one who cleaned floors, changed bulbs, someone with nothing to be proud of. But I've learned something since then. Sometimes if you live right, the place that cast you out finds its way back to you. Because dignity doesn't live in a title or a position. It lives in how you face pain without letting it turn you into someone you're not. For a moment, there was silence, a still, reverent kind of silence, and then applause began. Slow at first, then swelling like a tide. I saw Ruth lower her head, tears sliding down her face. Lydia reached for her hand, smiling through her own. Elliot lifted his camera. I saw his hands shake as he caught the moment. I didn't say another word. I simply bowed and stepped down. As I walked toward the back of the hall, I felt a gaze following me. When I turned, I saw him, Mason, standing alone near the exit. No lab coat this time, just a simple shirt. He didn't move forward. Didn't speak. His head lowered, then lifted, and our eyes met. In his face, I saw something changed. Not guilt, not apology, but understanding. I gave him a small nod. That was enough. Some things don't need to be spoken. Sometimes an acknowledgement is its own kind of forgiveness. Outside, the afternoon sun streamed through the glass panels, spreading across the hallway like sheets of gold. I walked through the courtyard, where a new sign had just been mounted, polished metal shining in the light, Evelyn Carver Wing, for compassionate care. I stopped. The breeze rustled through the trees, scattering yellow leaves at my feet. I read her name slowly, as if it were a prayer. Evelyn, you're home again. Around me, nurses passed in clusters, their rubber soles whispering against the tile. One young nurse paused, stooped to pick up a paper that had fallen, dropped it in the trash. A small act barely noticeable, yet I saw in it something achingly familiar. What Evelyn once called the language of kindness. By the time I stepped outside, the sun was beginning to set. The Cape Fear shimmered gold in the distance, the air thick with salt and warmth. I walked slowly, listening to the wind thread its way through my jacket, to the sound of leaves being swept up by janitors across the park. Somewhere children laughed. Everything was ordinary again, but ordinary in a new way. And I thought maybe justice isn't punishment at all. Maybe it's the quiet moment when a person finally sees what they've done and chooses to make it right. It doesn't arrive with noise. It comes like dawn without announcement, but inevitable. I sat on a bench overlooking the river and pulled from my pocket a small scrap of paper, a torn piece of Evelyn's old letter I'd carried for years. I read the same line I always did: "Honest is the only weakness that can change someone." I smiled. You were right from the beginning, Evelyn. The hospital glowed across the water, its windows catching the last of the sun. The reflection shone like a candle in the dusk. And as the world turned quiet again, a thought rose in my mind, not loud, but certain, like the final line of a story. When someone shouts, "Get out," sometimes that's just the moment when truth walks in. Thank you for listening. If you too believe that kindness is humanity's quietest strength, share this story, leave a comment, subscribe. Because sometimes one small act of grace is all it takes for justice to find its way home.